Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Let's Talk Privacy and Technology series. I'm Lourdes Turrecha, your host. I'm the Privacy Tech and Law Fellow at Santa Clara Law, where I'm also an adjunct professor. And I'm really excited to talk about de-identification today with our guest, Luke Arbuckle, who is the Chief Methodologist at Privacy Analytics. As you know, in the series, we talk about things like privacy engineering and privacy enhancing technologies and things like today, de-identification and anonymization. And so, as our guests do in every episode, Luke will walk us through and explain our these concepts. And I'm really excited and looking forward to that. Luke, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to start us off with the burning question in everyone's minds, which is, what does a chief methodologist do?
It's a great question. The title comes from national statistical organizations that have methodologists to look at what's called statistical disclosure control, which is the statistical side of anonymization. So a methodologist looks at the methods by which we evaluate data, the way that we, and then of course the methods themselves, but also it's just the framework, the principles, and how do we actually render data so that it's non-identifying and non-personal. And then everything around that as well. So how do we implement that? All those pieces kind of fall into there as well.
Thank you for that. I'd love, and I suppose I usually start with this question, but I just had to do away with that burning question first. I'd love for you to walk us through how you ended up in the intersection of privacy and technology, and particularly in your role as Chief Methodologist at Privacy Analytics. What got you to where you are right now?
It's a good question. I've given presentations to universities about this for students. I did not have a straight line path from my original engineering studies and then mathematics and then statistics. Privacy was not on the roadmap. It wasn't something I ever considered. I don't even know if we had courses in it, at least on the engineering mathematics side. But I took an interest in biostatistics. At one point in my career, I went back to school and decided I want to do more biostatistics. I wanted to be in the field of healthcare, do something where you feel like you're contributing in some way to health and outcomes and whatnot. So in the course of that, it's kind of a funny story. I was doing some blogging and I was online chatting with some people about health statistics, basically. And one of the things I like to do is I like to take a complex thing and try and translate it to a broader audience. So that's kind of what I was doing at the time. And I ended up meeting someone online who was the chief statistician at a children's hospital. Go figure. And he said at one point, he introduced me to someone who was doing research at their research institute. And I went in and had a conversation and I had no idea what the field was. I knew nothing about it. I was very interested in privacy. That's why I went to the interview. But I asked flat out, I said, well, why do you need a statistician? I had no idea. I knew nothing about this field. So it was rather serendipitous, to be honest. It was just chance encounters that led to it. But from there, I got to join the children's hospital, do some research, started working with clients, writing a book, and it kind of grew from there. To my current role, it's actually because I did all of that, the research and working with clients, doing advisory and whatnot. And then I worked for a privacy commissioner. So I was a privacy commissioner for 2 years, director of technology analysis, learned about all kinds of pets, learned about user interface design and how it affects privacy, all these really interesting aspects that were less in my field originally. And from there, basically the people I'd worked with at the Children's Hospital and others invited me to come to Privacy Analytics as the chief methodologist to bring that knowledge both of the technologies, but also the broader perspective from a regulatory standpoint.
And you worked with a Canada commissioner who, as you know, is one of the leading data protection regulators out there. So what was that like? I'm always curious to hear, I'm assuming you worked with Anne Cavoukian at some point.
No.
Okay.
I have, but not there. So I have worked with Anne Cavoukian separately. I worked with her before I was at the Privacy Commissioner's office.
Oh, wow.
So when I went to the Privacy Commissioner's office, I worked for who the Privacy Commissioner still today is Deidentification. Brilliant person. I learned a ton. I worked with him and I reported first to Patricia Cassine, who is now the Privacy Commissioner for Ontario, which is where Anne Cavoukian used to be actually. Yeah, right. So I worked for her, both of us reported into the commissioner. That honestly, it was very eye-opening. I learned a lot about the pressures, the incentives that they're under, all the challenges. What's interesting is that the privacy commissioner in Canada was actually one of the very first to have a technology team. And so they had when I was there, we were about 8 people working in technology. experts. We had a psychologist, we had cybersecurity people, we had quite a range. And from there, now you're starting to see, like, then, you've got the CNIL in France, you've got Ireland now. We worked with a lot of these organizations, of course, but the OPC, the Canada, was one of the first to kind of really build a pretty strong technology group. But now it's become, obviously, privacy and technology, huge intersection. So everyone's building up a technology team like that.
Exactly. And that was the point that I was trying to get to, was that in many ways, the Privacy Commissioner of Canada has been leading when it comes to, the frontiers of technology and privacy. And so it's, it's nice to hear from folks who were there and who have worked in the office. And fast forward years later, what keeps you in this space? So you've been, with the regulators. You work at Privacy Analytics now, which is is it still a startup, considered a startup, or not?
No.
No, I think at this point it's way more mature, but in the private sector. What gets you excited about privacy and technology, or to rephrase, what keeps you working in this space?
It's a great question. I'm fortunate. I've had a breadth of experience, right? I was able to work on the technology side. I was able to work for a commissioner, and I learned a lot about the policy side and the legal side as well through those interactions, obviously. And that's really why I'm still here, because it's so interesting. Before I went into statistics and got into this field, I worked on an engineering side, more algorithm based, and you build an algorithm, you test it, you evaluate it. It's kind of black and white. You have your evaluation metrics, you test it, you're done. Privacy is so malleable, right? It's such a complex topic. And because there's not just legal interpretations and policy interpretations, but there's also people's opinions, right? People, how do they feel about this? That's one way to think about privacy, is how do my kids, how do my parents feel about, what companies are doing, how they're using their data? How do they feel? In my case, we work in mostly healthcare, right? All the tremendous benefits that we can bring by enabling the use of this data. So there's just so many aspects to privacy and technology that it's sort of never ending. You're never going to stop learning. There's always going to be new technologies, but there's also this positive side where you're contributing, right? You're bringing technology and privacy together and bringing it into large enterprises. That's what we do, is do it at scale. I find that fascinating. I really enjoy it. I have great conversations with the legal and the policy folks, as well as the technology. So it's that hybrid of all these different interdisciplinary sides and all the constant challenges of what we're doing.
I love your point about the different interpretations of, what the law says and the policy implications of that. And then you have the technical interpretation of what the law says and the implementation, or like, how do you drill that down from those high level rules and principles to the ones and zeros? And that part fascinates me too. And that's why it's really the reason why we have this series, is to get technologists like you to come and teach and talk about the work that you do and educate the public in general as to what that means. I'd love to dig deeper into our theme for this episode, de-identification. When did you start working in? Is that when with the Children's Hospital? I do know that health laws, from a general perspective, had added de-identification requirements earlier than other industries or other comprehensive privacy laws in general. So I'm curious if that's where you started working on de-identification methods, and maybe share with us how that's changed over the course of your career. Like how far have you gone in terms of improving these methodologies and techniques?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, it goes back to when I started working at the Children's Hospital. That's when we started looking at these methods, the statistical side of this, the statistical disclosure control. But there's also a computer science aspect. There's, like you said, a policy aspect. The nice thing about working in the health field and in biostatistics, that was what I was originally interested in. I wanted to work at a children's hospital doing biostatistics. You learn a lot about how to balance data sets. For example, demographic factors, right? You want to balance your data set, have good statistics, clinical trials, all these kinds of things, right? A lot of that, and a lot of the ethics piece as well, fit perfectly into this framework. So a lot of the stuff we were doing and considerations were already built into just the framework of being at a hospital. But like you said, there was HIPAA that was introduced. We had PHIPAA in Ontario. And so there was now an incentive to de-identify, right? We'll use that term for now. And so that actually sets some groundwork in terms of what do we mean. And HIPAA, the language itself, if you go back a little bit in history, it's basically the language of statistical disclosure control. It's from the Census Bureau and other national statistical organizations. This is the technology that they use. The terms they use are a little bit different than on the computer science side, but that's where, at least for HIPAA, that you can see the language is right there. They talk about statistical methods, scientific methods, right? That's where it all comes from. But then you got to look at historically, this stuff goes back. I mean, I want to say I remember papers from the 60s and 70s. Like, this stuff goes back pretty far. So in terms of how it's changed in my career, there's been a huge, well, I mean, let's face it, GDPR, right? GDPR sets up huge incentives, right? So that's really changed it. Now we have CCPA as well. We have other countries, Brazil, others that are introducing similar laws. So suddenly, the idea of I'll call it statistical disclosure control was specific to national statistical organizations. It was them that did it to share data publicly, census statistics, but also share data with researchers, other organizations, and they share it in different ways. All of that is now being translated over this period that I've been in this field, is now being translated to industry. And our biggest problem really, let's say 10 years ago, was that the words, and even today the words are a problem, we'll probably get into that as well, but no one really knew what it meant, right? There was a lot of confusion, and that's why I keep going back to statistical disclosure control, because it's very precise, and it was a technology and a methods that were very well known. But now it's taken this long to kind of get us to this point where now it's actually something people do. Industry is now thinking about it. 10 years ago, when we said this, I think in our first book, this idea of bringing ethics reviews to industry, people brushed us off, said, you're crazy. We're never going to do that in industry. And now it's the hottest topic in technology, is about ethics, which I think is fascinating.
Right. You mentioned the lack of uniformity when it comes to words. And I've seen that from the legal policy side with the different laws and different definitions of what it means to de-identify and pseudonymize and anonymize and whatnot. Are you also seeing that from the practitioners, from your side, from the statisticians? Is there a consensus as to what it means to de-identify? And I'm assuming, well, I'll leave you to answer that before I put in my thoughts.
Okay. Yes and no, right? There are different communities, and this is the part of the fun of it, really. There was a conference two weeks ago on exactly this topic. It was for the technologists, right? And you had different camps. You had computer scientists, you had statisticians. I've been on calls just recently, in fact, with those two groups, and they don't speak the same language. It's actually some of the research we're doing now with universities is about creating a framework where we can have a common language, because a lot of people don't even realize they're talking about the same thing. In fact, like they're using these different terms and different theoretical foundations. But I mean, statistics is something that's been around for a long time, and we can use a mathematical framework to tie them together and realize, oh, we're kind of saying the same thing. They're a little bit different. They deal with privacy, these technical privacy metrics, in a slightly different way, but there's a lot of commonality, and that's the real crux of it. If you talk to people like me, of course, and any of this space, any of the computer science side, the stat side, there are models that exist. There are technical privacy metrics that exist, but you did mention one of the core challenges there. It's taking that idea, those statistical concepts are not easy to understand. Not everyone's going to get that, right? It's something that we have to work on. Taking that and move it into a policy legal framework. Well, what are we talking about, right? How do we bridge that gap and make sure everyone understands? So yes, I think that there's still some education happening. People still don't always understand. They still think, for example, take out their names and it's okay. You know this, I know this because we're in the privacy space, but there's still people who are still learning, right? They still don't know because it's not necessarily everywhere yet. In health field, I would say probably more so because we've had a lot of experience with regulations that do require that, but in a lot of other places, no. And let's be honest, I didn't know about this until I entered the field. So you can imagine an epidemiologist or a clinical statistician won't even know about it, right? It's a unique expertise. And so not everyone knows that, so.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned this earlier, but you really get into the point of how cross-functional privacy is, right? I mean, we know all about the bridging that we've had to do between the technical folks and the legal folks, but even within the legal folks, there are things that we debate as to when it comes to word definitions and scope. And it sounds like the same is true when it comes to the computer science, subset and the statisticians. And it's the journey of it, and everyone's at different points of their journey. Like you said, you didn't come to it until you got into the community. And how do we solve that? Or do standards a part of the answer? Or are there other ways to go about addressing that issue, the language gap and the barrier, the bridging that we need to do in order to get on with the work of actually de-identifying and protecting personal data?
Yeah, I mean, you look at something like the chief data officer, right? This is something that we have a conference that we're a part of, and they talk about the same sort of problem, this lack of understanding of just analytics in general. How do we understand data and how we use data? That's challenging, right? It's going to require education. It's going to require people who are curious, that want to understand. That's one of the things I always talk about. You have to be curious. You have to want to understand the legal policy arguments and why there's a disconnect, and where they actually have a lot of common ground. So education is part of it, just explain these things to people. Standards are critical, right? We do have great guidance that have been developed by national statistical organizations, ICO, for example, and then the UK Anonymization Network. There's some that's out of Canada, there's some that's out of Europe, and there's a bunch of these, right? These help, obviously, because they start to set some of the expectations. But regardless, it's a complex field, right? So we do a lot of work to try and explain and make this accessible. Our most recent book is an example of that, trying to show the complexity and the breadth of, and this is the other thing, I suppose, it's not just about this endpoint, right? I want to anonymize or de-identify the data. People tend to think of it as an endpoint, but there's so much in between, right? You're transforming data ultimately. You're trying to render people hidden, let's say. We're hiding people in the data, right? You can hide people a little bit or a lot, right? There's a spectrum there, but that also means there's a lot of opportunity. So all those little nuances, I mean, it's like the law. You're not just going to wake up one day and everything's going to be solved, right? We're going to keep discussing it. We're going to keep learning, like any technology. But again, that bridge with privacy is what makes it interesting, and what means we're just going to have to keep working at it. But the standards, like as you mentioned, those are very important. There's a lot there, and we're going to keep working on those, of course.
Yeah. I mean, great point. I mean, that was the one thing that came quickly, to mind. And I suppose we've been dancing around it, and I think we should just go ahead and tackle it, the theme for this episode. I'd love for you to share with us your definition of, the concepts de-identification, pseudonymization, and anonymization, and what they mean to you, so that we certainly have practitioners dial in from our alumni community and Silicon Valley community. We also have privacy law students and privacy tech startups dial in and listen. So please, I mean, we'd love for you to share with us what de-identification means to you. I mean, it's your work every day, for the last few years, and help educate our community.
Sure. So, I mean, the word pseudonymization has really come out of GDPR, right? We all know this. But look at the roots of the word, right? To create a pseudonym, to take someone's name out and put, fake information in there. You can throw away the key that was used to generate it, or you can keep it depending on what you're trying to accomplish. In some cases, for example, you talk about having pseudonymous healthcare, where maybe the lab technician doesn't need to see the person's name, so you put a pseudonym in, but when the results come back, the doctor has to unlock that and put their name back, right? So that's the basic idea of pseudonymization. There's a gray zone in between, and there's various ways you can think of that, but that's sort of the core concept. I really struggle with the words de-identification and anonymization, because we work globally, right? We're now a company of over 100 experts that we're training, and then they're out talking to people all over the world. So if you talk to someone in the UK and use the word de-identification, that word actually means take out their names. That's literally what it means in that context. Not what we're talking about. We're talking about HIPAA, for example, right? Two very different things. But they use de-identification and anonymization. But then there's some ISO standards work that has said, well, de-identification is that process of transforming data from identifiable to non-identifiable, right? Well, that just adds more confusion, because now it's not just an endpoint, it's now a process. So, very confusing, very, very context driven. So let's take a step back. I'm going to push those words aside. I'm going to use the same word we use in our book, anonymization, the process and what we're trying to do with the data. So something that we started, I wrote a white paper about, I want to say 2 years ago now, and I found it to be a really simple way. And unfortunately, I don't have any slides or anything. I didn't prepare anything here, but it's this idea. If you haven't heard of it, look up this idea of the 5 safes. I think it's a great framework to really simplify what we're talking about. And again, this comes back from the world of statistical disclosure control. It was developed by Felix Ritchie for the Office of National Statistics in the UK. So the basic idea is you have 5 things you're looking at when you want to look at data. You look at the projects, safe projects. So this, we talk about the legal boundaries, right? The ethical uses of the data. Where's the data going? Where's it come from? Data flows, right? We want to make sure that what we're doing, do we even want to anonymize the data or render the data less identifiable? Maybe you don't. Maybe in some cases you need that. Then we got to look at the people, safe people. Are the people accessing the data, are they public? Or are they researchers inside of a medical institution, right? There's certain things we can look at there in terms of governance and whatnot. Then we have the settings, the safe settings. In what environment do they actually have access to the data? So up to this point, we haven't even talked about the data, really. We talked about the data flows, the projects, the legal boundaries, the people, and the settings. But that's actually critical for how national statistical organizations have been releasing data. Obviously, they release a lot of data publicly, but they also do a lot of data sharing between universities and other organizations. So the next 2 are about the data. Safe data, we start looking at, well, what is in the data? What's identifiable in it? Not just their names. Their names, I mean, just assume if you're going to anonymize, you're getting rid of their names. You're going to get rid of anything that's directly identifiable. But then there's their dates of birth. There's postal codes, zip codes, there's medical information, etc. There's a lot of stuff there, right? And then finally, we look at the safe outputs. We're going to be generating statistics from that data. We want to make sure it's safe. So all of those pieces together are what the framework that we use to look at whether or not data is safe, right? And that's really at the heart of anonymization. It's not just the technology to transform data to be non-identifiable. Non-identifiable is contextual. Where am I giving the data? Who's going to have access to it? Because it changes the threats to the data. So it's very much, so I know you interviewed Professor Hartzog about this. He wrote a great paper with Rubenstein about anonymization and risk, which talks about the same sort of thing. It's sort of an IT security type framework where you look at threats. And this is what they've been doing by national statistical organizations have been doing for decades, literally. And so this framework just lets you, those 5 things, make it really easy to put up a slide and say, here are the 5 things we're going to look at, and then go deeper into what kind of governance, what kind of security controls, et cetera. But I find it's a good way to kind of think of the whole holistic view of everything we want to do.
Thank you. That was an excellent overview. So I appreciate that. When it comes to risk, how do you have these conversations with your clients? I mean, and in addition to that, what are the use cases that you see keep coming up when you're having these conversations? Obviously, the health context is it's a given context. It's been there for years, but with more and more laws like GDPR, is the conversation driven by compliance? Are there other types of risks outside of regulatory and compliance risk that you hone in on when you have the conversation with potential clients about why we need to go about doing this and protecting data?
That's a great question. So this kind of leads to sort of a broader topic in a way, because it's not just about the data, right? As we said, with the 5 safes, there's a lot of other things. But what's interesting, so just to give you a recent example, working with various global partners, I gave a 1-day workshop on privacy engineering, a whole day just talking about what is privacy engineering. Mm-hmm. But also with another organization, it was looking at that same kind of thing, but looking at not just privacy, which I found really interesting. So I'm a big fan of the NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. They're doing the privacy framework. They've done some great work in privacy engineering. Really, really great work there. I mean, it's great work. I know there's other work happening elsewhere in the world because I'm involved in that as well. But I find the NIST stuff is getting a lot of industry focus and input. And so they're creating frameworks that are very usable, right? They're really, really helpful. So come back to the point. So where does that really fit? Well, when they talk about privacy and privacy engineering in particular, they're talking about building trustworthy systems, right? And that's where I find this is really interesting because it goes beyond just the anonymization. It goes to the idea of well, what else, what other benefits can we get from this, right? So in a trustworthy system, and this is the sort of challenges we hear from people, is that you're often working with very big organizations, right? We're working with multinationals. They have different regulations depending on what region they're in, obviously, right? You could be in France or Germany or the UK, and it's all GDPR, but each has a different regulator, right? And so they have different interpretations. How do they manage that? They have people working in different parts of the world trying to access data. Well, if I'm an analyst, or maybe I'm a project owner of some kind. So I want to put my data on a platform and say, here's access to this data, but I need to trust that system, not just in terms of privacy, but in terms of that I know what's going to happen with that data. I know that the governance is in place. I know that anyone who wants to access data is going to have to go through me, for example. There's going to be certain manageability in terms of the controls, the selective disclosures, all these pieces that fit into the whole world of the NIST frameworks and whatnot in privacy engineering come into play. So it's interesting because it's not just about privacy. It is, but it's also about all these benefits you get from having a trusted framework and a trusted system that you as an analyst can just go in and use, and you can trust that other people are either not using it or are, and for the right purposes. So the ethics checks, all the governance starts coming into play. So it's just so much bigger than just the one topic of is it identifiable or not. It's about everything else around that I find fascinating, and that's where we kind of lead the conversation often.
I mean, and I'm just picturing that conversation, and it does seem very fascinating, especially if you're working with a client that's global and has to deal with GDPR and HIPAA in the US if they have their own health plan that they're governed under, or if they're in the healthcare industry. And so standards like this become very important because you have all of these different requirements. Do you see a lot of tensions when it comes to, tackling privacy engineering, data governance in general at a global level, and specifically from an anonymization perspective? How much tension do you see because of the lack of uniformity in definitions and requirements and what this means here? So what ends up happening? Do you end up saying this is what it means to anonymize under the GDPR, but if you're in here, that's not what we mean actually? So how do you work with your clients when that's the case? And I'm asking this because a couple of practitioners, I've been through that myself, and a couple of practitioners who are in attendance have also share the same sentiment. I'd love to hear your expert advice, because this is basically what you do with your clients.
No, it's a great question, and it's not easy necessarily, right? Yes, there are nuances and there are interpretations that are different. Even, I mean, look at GDPR. There's not a lot of language. You have to look at what do they mean by personal information, and then look at the definitions. They talk about basically all reasonable means to re-identify. They don't use exactly that word, but that's the basic idea. They talk about objective factors, and there's not much more, right? You go to HIPAA, and then you actually have some language that says, oh, statistical methods, and they talk about risk, which is, quite frankly, throws people off. They hear the word risk and they say, whoa, there can't be risk here, but it's a statistical view. And if you look at the NIST framework, it's also about risk. It's about minimizing risk, managing risk. So the word risk throws people off depending on what jurisdiction and what framework they're under. The language is different, as you said, it's not standardized. So our approach is, obviously we're trying to address, we are working in all these jurisdictions, so we are addressing them in slightly different ways. Our approach is very principles based. We look at all of these things and we say, okay, well, we'll just make sure that we can address any of them. Then you can tweak, right? You can say, well, and again, it's not, we can't dictate this, right? We give best practices, we suggest, we advise, and then we explain to our clients the differences. So if they're only going to be under HIPAA, then we'll explain that, what are the boundaries there, and let them make the decision on what they feel comfortable with. And same thing with GDPR. We have to then change the conversation, the words a little bit, because the language is different, obviously. But principally, we're not doing that much that's really different, to be honest. We just have to make some slightly different concessions. So maybe under HIPAA, for example, you're going to have a primary use with this data. You're going to first, maybe you de-identify it under HIPAA, and then you do your analysis, but you have to come back and tie those results to an individual because it could affect their health. And maybe if there's a good reason to re-identify. So you keep that pseudonymized key so you can unlock their name, That may be okay under HIPAA, but maybe in a particular region in Germany, let's say, that's not okay. The interpretation has been throw away the key. So again, it's up to the client to kind of navigate that, but we help them, we give them the guidance, and we let them explain to them sort of the boundaries. But principally, we're not changing much. We're still looking at those 5 safes, trying to figure out, how do we ensure we render the data non-identifiable within their contextual needs. I mean, at the end of the day, they have a business to run. They have, again, we work mostly in healthcare, but not exclusively. But we have to look at what are they trying to achieve, and how can we get them to that? Because we don't want to stop what they're doing, especially in healthcare, but in general, it's just how do we enable it? That's where the privacy engineering comes in. It's not on off, right? It's a continuous thing you're trying to refine and improve. I don't know if that helped, because it's very, as you know, it's very complicated, right? Depending on the jurisdiction.
It is, and you said something about, determining what their goals are and leading with principles. And that's really how you start, right? You don't want to start building and advising without understanding what the client's trying to accomplish. Are they really just worried about compliance with HIPAA, or do they want something that is higher level and broader data governance program that targets, not just XYZ compliance, but their goal of establishing trust with their customers. And so I like that point that you made about start being principles based and understanding the customer's goals first and foremost. I wanted to pivot us and ask you about the future and what you feel, how you feel about the future of privacy and technology. And you're free to keep that conversation within the context of your work and in anonymization, or, take it as broad as you want. I love this question because every privacy professional has a different answer, and it makes me think like, oh, that's a good point.
So I'm an optimist, right? And the reason I am where I am is because I like to find solutions. So I'm optimistic. One of the things I learned when I was at the Privacy Commissioner's Office, I mentioned a psychologist, for example, who bridged the divide from psychology into user design and how privacy fit into that, and how you can, lead a person in one way or another. And it was very fascinating. But one of the things we talked about when the Privacy Commissioner sort of initiated a review of pets and the future of technology, because we did that when I was there, there was this idea of incentives as well, right? So we started with anonymization and HIPAA. Well, these were critical. Industry is not going to necessarily anonymize unless they see benefit to it. So obviously if there's a compliance piece, that's a pretty big incentive. But then, like, as I mentioned, there's other internal incentives when you talk more broadly about privacy engineering and anonymization in terms of reducing risks in general. And, that trust that even people internally have concerns regarding privacy, right? So they're going to see this data and go, should I be even looking at this person's name? Like these sorts of things are an incentive, but they're not as much as like a legislation. So you get GDPR come in and you start talking about privacy by design and Kavukian's framework, which is now part of GDPR, and suddenly the whole conversation has changed, right? So I'm optimistic. I love the book, The Privacy Blueprint by Woodrow Hartzog, who you interviewed, because it came right after that, after we had done this internal sort of review and introspection. And that's kind of the way I think of things as well. Like, yes, GDPR and CCPA and all these things are really advancing in terms of data protection and privacy. But I love this idea of sort of a consumer protection approach to privacy, where it's not on or off. It's a little bit broader. It's looking at, the incentives as well. And so I'm hopeful that these things continue to advance and that we start seeing more of that. If that sort of answers your question.
Yeah, and I'm like you. I'm an optimistic realist, basically. Yeah. And like you, I'm a big fan of Woody's book, and we talked a little bit about that during his episode, and his design agenda for privacy laws, because before GDPR, it's mostly focused on process and do no harm and don't lie and FIPS. But I do appreciate his taking it a step further and proposing an agenda for design. And it's nice to see that the GDPR incorporate and Kavukian's principles. Based on, what are some of your most optimistic predictions in this space in the future? And
you know, nothing's too crazy.
Nothing's too crazy. Well, optimistic. So I'll give you one that's fan fiction, let's call it, for
Yeah.
privacy. So if you're familiar with Isaac Asimov, he wrote a series called Foundations. In it, and of course, I don't see this happening, but in it, there's one of the series, there's this idea that you can predict social behavior. You can create these mathematical models that look at psychology, economics, you know, the behavioral psychology kind of thing, and start predicting sort of society. So I was thinking about this, you know, wouldn't it be amazing if you had a piece of software where you're drawing out, as I mentioned, I did engineering before, and I did a course in systems engineering. You can model, you know, electricity, you can model water flow, a variety of mechanical systems. What if you could model your system, your complex, what we call a functional architecture? You draw this out, it tells you what you need to do and why you need to do it. But in that framework, you also predicted aspects of privacy, right? So you can go back to the engineering, privacy engineering objectives, but it's sort of like predicting almost behavioral psychology, because of course there's so many aspects to privacy. It's not like a technology, but if you could predict that in building a system, that would be amazing. Now, again, I don't know if that's possible. I don't think it is, but that would be sort of my dream. If someone invents that, I think that would be pretty awesome.
That sounds amazing. I mean, the things that come to mind immediately are like, it's so hard because privacy is so first cultural and then second personal, right? And so are we taking like a majority, like are the predictions going to be based on, you know, majority of people's expectations? And yeah, we can.
Well, if you're familiar with the, I'm sure you are, the privacy engineering framework by NIST, you've got those three, and there's other frameworks that have this as well, but they have three objectives, right? The NIST one is predictability, manageability, and disassociability. So you can imagine you click somewhere on your system design, your architecture, and it shows you sort of an equalizer of how these things are balanced at that point. And you click somewhere else and it shows you that would be phenomenal.
No, that would be fun. So outside of anonymization and the work that you do, what other privacy and technology issue keeps you up at night? What do you think is the biggest, you know, issue in the intersection of privacy and technology today?
What keeps me up at night? Ooh, that's a challenging one. Well, because I'm so solutions driven, yeah, well, I'm not necessarily, okay, so you know, sometimes you gotta kind of take a step back, right? You gotta be practical, right? So yes, I understand. I'm a big proponent of, I went into biostatistics to do, you know, health statistics. That was what I was interested in, public health and healthcare. So for me, there's huge benefits to using data in those circumstances. So I always think of it in terms of the benefits as well. I want to know how we're going to use that data. So what keeps me up at night, of course, is, you know, I think of my kids, right? You think of like, what's the future going to look like for them, right? And it's the reason, I mean, I've already got 2 other books in the back of my mind that I want to write because I just want to keep pushing in this direction where we have practical solutions. We can give frameworks to people and say, we can, I hate the conversation about privacy is dead. I think that's, you're just giving up, right? I mean, that doesn't make sense. There's societal benefit to a lot of the things that we're doing, right? Obviously healthcare is the easy one in a sense, and it's the one I love to work in, but there's other things too. There's a lot of things that we get from this. We have to find out, you know, where we want to sort of lean things, like what do we consider ethically appropriate? And there's a lot of conversation about that. Personal opinion here is when we talk about ethics, people tend to repeat the FIPS as well, the Fair Information Practice Principles, and I kind of disappointing. And so, you know, I wrote a chapter about ethics in the book. I want to take a different tack. Hopefully it resonates, but the idea was, and it's built off some of Woody's stuff as well, on trust, because I felt that was really important. So when I worked at the privacy regulators, I say stress a little bit more in a way, because you're bombarded every day with the news stories and you had to be on point, right? The commissioner comes in your office and says, I want to know about this technology. I had to be ready. And my team would be, you know, helping me, of course. But it was, you spent a lot more time. Now I kind of try to take a step back and go, let's work on methods to improve and to sort of, you know, move things forward, as opposed to focusing on the negatives. Let's focus on how do we make this happen? And I think a lot has changed. I mean, the world is, in a way, has moved in a new direction with GDPR and others. So, and with, you know, new ideas in terms of how we mold privacy of the future, I think there's a lot of good that's coming out of this as well. So I'm hopeful, and nothing's really necessarily keeping me up at night, but, you know, I obviously, you know, take precautions as well because I am work in this space. So
it sounds like you've turned that into a practical, you know, optimistic thing. And instead of looking at it, you know, the lack of process, the lack of methods in the space and worrying about that, you've turned that on its head and addressed that directly. So it ends up not keeping you up at night. That's
well, you know, it's that I forget in what field it's in, but it's that idea that people tend to remember the negatives a lot more than the positives.
Yeah.
And so you got to be really careful, because if you look at every single little thing that might go wrong, they may be very rare. And I'm a statistician, so I got to use my analytical brain and go, okay, hold on a second here. Let's put this in context. Oh, it's 1 in a million or 1 in 1,000. And you know, we're living in a very strange time right now where we're literally having to kind of think about these things more than we normally would. So, you know, especially now, you got to take a step back and go, okay, what can I do that's positive and help in this? And just remember, those stories are meant to be a little bit, you know, overblown, let's say, to kind of get media attention. So you got to put them in context and then think, how am I going to help, right? Especially if you're working in the space as a lawyer or a technologist.
I mean, exactly. And it's exactly the reason why you have people saying privacy is dead, or, you know, why the GDPR has those draconian fines, right? Like they want to hone, they want the message out there, but at the same time, you, like you said, you have to look at the risk and the likelihood and of that risk materializing. And just to add to your point about the privacy is dead conversation, not only is it annoying and, you know, it's also not true, right? We've gone through more than 100 years of literature where folks predict privacy dying, and it's still very much alive today and is one of the biggest issue that we're dealing with, outside obviously with the pandemic and you know, the racial tensions that we're dealing with, and climate change. But it's up there. It's up there. We do have some folks who are interested in the tech side to privacy. And I would love to pick your brain. I mean, since you're here already, I'd love for you to share with them, you know, your advice as to how they could find their way, you know, working within the intersection of privacy and technology. Like, what's worked for you? We for instance, we talked about being curious earlier, but if there were some things that helped you navigate your career, I'm sure they'd be very grateful.
Sure. I've worked with a few companies recently actually looking to hire people for privacy engineering roles. So if you're on the technology side, I mean, it really, some of the stuff is kind of generic, right? It applies to anyone. If you're on the technology side and you're thinking of privacy engineering, I would say hone your skills in your field first, right? Be really good at what you do, because ultimately as a technologist, your job is to be a technologist. Your job is not to be the lawyer, right? Your job is to be the technologist. And if you're a lawyer, of course, you need to hone your skill as a lawyer first, right? You can concentrate in privacy. That's a lot harder to do in tech. You can take maybe some classes. There's some, you know, IPP, ISACA now has a privacy engineering certification. There's opportunities to learn, but really hone your skills. And for me, I think what's been the most beneficial to my growth in my career, one, be extremely curious, you know, get out there, really be curious about the legal policy perspective, right? Talk to the lawyers, understand their perspective, and see how you can translate technology to them. Because that's really the genius. If you can take your field, be it legal or technology, and translate it to a lay audience, right? I loved Woody's example of it, trying to explain what privacy is to his son, right? That's a great example. And I've talked to so many people, even at Privacy Analytics, that have done exactly that exercise. What do you do, Daddy? And it's a tough one. I have my own little side story on exactly that. But anyway, that's my advice, is learn to translate knowledge in your field to a broader audience. And that's going to help you bridge the divide, because cross-functional teams are the most effective. I have had some great teams that I've worked with in the past, and it's because they came from such a breadth: physics, statistics, computer science, psychology, economics, right? There's so many perspectives that you can bring into not just privacy in general, but it's very true in privacy. There is an economic side, there is a legal side. There's so many interesting facets.
Technology side
You
too.
gotta communicate, right? That's number one.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't have said it, better than you. I do want to take the opportunity to ask a question that one of the attendees posed, and it's your take on differential privacy. It's certainly one of the leading pets that's being implemented out there. We've seen companies like Apple and Google come up with open source, their open source technologies on differential privacy, and so
Neil is asking, your thoughts on it and whether you think it's matured enough to be reliable at this stage.
I think it depends. I mean, one of the reasons that it's so popular is because it has that mathematical side. So if you're in the sciences, it's publish or perish, right? And we were actually working with different universities on a variety of different metrics. I'll call them technical privacy metrics. Differential privacy belongs to one of those. There's actually about 85, according to a recent survey, different privacy metrics. And there's a really nice taxonomy published by Isabel Wagner called technical privacy metrics. And she creates this little grid to show all the different bubbles of, these classifications, and differential privacy is within one, but there's actually 7 other ones. There's no one tool that's going to fit every circumstance. Differential privacy, if you look at some of the early stuff, which was known as randomized response, they've now shown, you can just make a few tweaks and it's the same, you can show this differentially private. That goes back to the 70s. So noise injection has been used in the statistics field for a long time. And it was suitable for that purpose, but it won't be suitable for others. For the technologists out there, there are different implementations, and there are very different assumptions between them. So if you're familiar a little bit, all these tools, doesn't matter which one you're talking about, which metric you're talking about, they all have parameters you have to set. And that's a really challenging thing. Regardless, even in differential privacy, you have a parameter you have to set. And there are things like correlations. There are things on how long do you let differential privacy run, so to speak. There's a privacy budget, they call it. A lot of organizations, they just refresh that budget. They don't actually maintain it, which then you start to ask yourself, well, is it actually doing what it's supposed to? The theoretical foundation depends on me, maintaining that privacy budget. So there's a lot of issues. It's really complicated, right? Is it mature enough? It is in some circumstances. We use a portfolio of different metrics. We don't use actually just one, because they really are, you can tailor them, right, depending on the circumstances. But the key thing is watch those parameters and watch the details of how it's implemented. Like all things, technology is, nuanced, and there's a lot of little details. I don't know if I'm trying to go too technical, but yes, it has its own challenges and its own limitations that you just have to be aware of. And be careful how you set that parameter as well, if that's suitable for your circumstances.
So maybe as a follow-up to that question, what are the circumstances or contexts that you think are best suited for the implementation of differential privacy versus other techniques?
So again, I don't hold to one particular technique. So and oftentimes you can use multiple. And you can actually find, that's what we're working on now, is we're working on a new publication, a new theoretical framework that actually ties a lot of these techniques together so people can kind of evaluate them and see where they overlap. But it's noise injection. So it's noise injection if you're doing like, again, very complicated question, but let's say you're doing tabular data, so count data, aggregated, right? I just want to know if I have, this many females of this age group, how many people are in that group, right? You could use differential privacy, inject noise. But if you're adding those up across columns or rows, do you need those to be maintained, those columns and rows? Because you don't want to suddenly have more females than you had before. Maybe you're just trying to randomize in between. A lot of little nuances like that. But if noise injection is something that is suitable for your circumstances, absolutely. It could be the right tool. But again, there's a lot of complexity there, because some of the just open source tools may not deal with all the structure and all the complex, like data is complex, right? You can talk about data in which what we call in my field, longitudinal data. So you're following someone over time. I have a medical event, and then the next day there's a couple other surgeries or things that have to be done. That's longitudinal. They're tracking me over time. You could have the aggregated data I mentioned. There's just so many different ways, the time series data. And a lot of the theoretical work in this space is still trying to address those. And then the question is, well, what is suitable in terms of that jurisdiction and those expectations in terms of privacy. So sorry, that's not a very clear answer, but it really does depend. It's like, that's a good lawyer answer, by the way. It depends.
Yeah, I have a shirt from one of my, former legal teams, legal swag that says, technically, maybe. You can go so many places from here. I do like your point. I mean, you basically, in sum, just went back to, it really depends on the context and what the goals are. And you start from there, and then you figure out the appropriate tool to use that will help you, form the analytics that you need to do. I can't believe we're almost, out of time. I feel like we can keep talking about this, and I have so many questions that I didn't get, but I would love to give you the opportunity to, if you have any closing message to our participants, if you want to invite them to reach out if they have questions for you, obviously up to you if you want to share where they can reach you online. If not, thank you so much for your time and for coming and sharing your experience in the space.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun. I have to admit, I didn't realize we had gone through the time so quickly as well.
I know.
If people want to reach out to me, I'm on LinkedIn. I don't really use Twitter so much. There's just too much noise. I just can't keep tabs on that. So I'm on LinkedIn. You can find my contact information there and reach out to me. I do a lot of public speaking and education still today. So I'm happy to chat with people, help them understand some of the issues. I try and post things on LinkedIn as well. Like the Wagner paper I mentioned earlier, I had actually posted that to LinkedIn. I posted some about privacy engineering. Try to, stay engaged. It's challenging, of course, but if people want, by all means, I'm happy to answer questions. And
we'll share links. We do have episode notes. So we'll share links to Luke's LinkedIn and his book and the papers that he mentioned. And if no one else has any questions, it looks like we're good. Thank you, everyone. And I'll look forward to the next episode and to continuing the conversation. We'll be talking about election privacy, election security, and voter privacy next week.
Awesome.
Thanks, Luke. Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.